Hey patrons, welcome back to the second part in this tutorial series. In this part we're going to be focusing on drawing a daisy in charcoal, and the materials that I'm going to be using are the same as the ones I did for the previous flower, but just to recap, I'm going to be using two pencils, the 6B charcoal pencil and a 2H charcoal pencil, both by the company Generals. I'm going to use two brushes, a filbert brush and a round fluffy brush, two blending stumps, a Tombow Mono stick eraser for the highlights and some details. I'm also going to be using my charcoal block and a kneaded eraser. So those are all of the materials that I'm using. As you can see, it's not an extensive supply list for this. I'm using a soft charcoal block as well. This gets it really nice and dark. And the technique that we're going to be using for the daisy is going to be exactly the same as for our first flower. So what I'm going to be doing is, like I said before, the pencil in the pencil extender is the 6B charcoal pencil, and when I'm just using a normal pencil without the pencil extender, that is the 2H pencil. So the first thing that I'm going to do is work on the background, and I'm starting by blocking in the darkest areas. And to do that, I am using the 6B charcoal pencil. The 6B is a lot softer and it's also darker as well. It works very much like with graphite pencils, where the H pencils are harder and the B pencils are the softer ones. It's very similar to that. And so I'm very lightly shading in the darkest areas for the background. I've attached the reference image and the sketch outline photos so that you can follow along with me. And as you can see from the reference, the background is very dark in this one as well. Just like in our first flower, the reference was very dark for the background in that one as well. And I'm going in little circular motions as I'm applying the charcoal pencil to really get a nice even coverage. But like I said, I'm not worrying about applying lots of pressure, because when we blend out with our brushes, it gives a really nice smooth finish. So I am outlining around the daisy petals as well. With the petals, these are different shaped petals than our first drawing. With our first drawings, you can see that it's a lot more complex, whereas with the daisies, the petals are very long and very thin, and there's a lot more of them. And they're more like uniform, similar shapes than the first flower. So I'm really taking my time as I do this, really studying the reference image, and I'm being very careful as I outline around the daisy petals. I want it to be nice and crisp like with our first flower, so I'm taking extra care as I outline to prevent getting really fuzzy edges. And like I mentioned before, I'm not really sharpening my 6B pencil too much because it's very short and I don't want to waste it. But for you guys that are using longer pencils, then make sure your pencils are nice and sharp at all times if you're doing detailed areas. If you're just shading in a large area, then you don't have to worry about getting it really sharp. But if you're going around the edge of the petals, then it's best to keep your pencil as sharp as possible. This whole flower study did take me a lot less time than our first one. The first one had a lot of different details in the petals. The petals were very different to each other, different shadows. So I spent more time on the first one on the petals that needed a lot more detail. Whereas this one, because the petals are very uniform, very similar shapes, they had similar shadows to them, and it was a lot quicker to get through this one. And that's one thing that I love about working in charcoal. It is quite a fast medium. And because you're working in grayscale, you don't have to worry about layering, mixing different colours. You just have to worry about getting your values light or dark enough. So if you're a beginner, then I do recommend starting with a grayscale medium like graphite or charcoal. I prefer charcoal because it's matte finish. It's not going to give lots of shine off. And I love how dark you can get the values. And I definitely think these free studies are great to have a go at if you are a beginner. You can see that I'm leaving out that bit at the top where it's a bit lighter. I'm going around that very much like I did in the first one, where I left areas that were a little bit lighter in the background. I left them white. I'm doing that same thing here because when we blend it out with the brush, we will be applying some of that charcoal up onto the white areas, the areas we've left white. So with this study, there is the main daisy in the front, which is the focal point, and then in the background we can see two other daisies, but they are very soft and blurred out. And the key to getting that soft blurred out of focus result is two things. Firstly, not adding too much detail. If it's out of focus, it's very blurry, there's not too much detail there. But secondly, you want to have a very soft transition. You want to have no like harsh edges or lines in the background. You want to make sure every value change is very, very soft and gradual. So we've got the very dark background, and then as we get towards the lighter petals, we want to make sure that there's a bit of a blurriness between the edge of the petals and the background. So it's not a very clean cut edge where the petals are. You want to make sure that when we blend it out, we will soften it out a lot. But for now, just like with the focal point, the focal daisy, with the daisy in the background, I'm going in and I'm outlining them as well for now. But when we blend it out, we will soften out that edge. I'm also adding all of the little shadows in between the petals. So you might see some of the background peeping through the little petals as well. And that's why it's important to study the reference image and to spot these things, because having the little background peeping through the petals is going to add contrast because the petals are very white and very bright. And then if you do the really dark background peeping through between those petals, it's going to make the petals stand out because you'll be contrasting them with the dark background. I'm moving on to the bottom left hand side now. Again, marking out where that highlighted area is going to be, and marking out around the flower as well. I find it easier to mark out the outline and then fill in that larger area. So I'm marking out any lighter areas. If you see me pausing like I did just there, it's most likely because I'm studying the reference image. I'm taking some time, I'm pausing, I'm stopping what I'm doing. I'm not constantly just carrying on drawing. I'm looking at the reference, I'm studying it, and I'm identifying any areas that I need to work on. I'm identifying where the next section is that I need to shade in. And I'm checking what I've already done to see if I'm happy with it. So it's important to look at your reference almost as much as you're looking at your actual drawing. So I've outlined that third daisy, the one in the background, and now the stem for that daisy is quite dark, so I've just coloured that in with the 6B, added some shading in there. And I'm adding some shading for the stem of the main daisy as well. It's very dark. If you look at the reference, it's very dark, almost blends in with the background. So I'm using the 6B to add a generous amount of shading to that area, but I won't apply it on any areas that are slightly lighter so that we have a bit of a difference in values. So you can see towards the middle of that stem I didn't add as much shading because it's slightly lighter. Now I'm going in with my charcoal block because of the fact that I've outlined around all of the areas. Now I can fill in that outline without worrying about getting any sort of charcoal inside the petals. I've got a nice clean edge now and I can just fill in the middle. This soft charcoal block is really, really dark, and so it is great for those darker values. I like to use it on its sides so that more of the charcoal actually comes off onto the paper. And like I said, all of the materials I'm using are listed in the description. I'm using the Arches Hot Press watercolour paper for this. So I'm using this to fill in all of those darkest areas. And even if you've added charcoal, like the 6B pencil, this pencil, this block is going to be so much darker than that. Even if the 6B pencil looked really dark, this is darker than that one. So you can go over the top of those 6B areas with this to get a darker look. So as you can see, I'm going back to that top area of the background, just adding some more shading, and you can see it's a lot darker. So I'm just going to carry on with this block and just finish off the background, and then I'll come back to talk you through the next step. Now that I'm happy with the background, I'm starting to add some shading on the center of the daisy. And one thing that a lot of people do wrong when they're doing like the inners of a flower like this, the center of the flower, is they do lots of little circles. And this is going to make it look flat and not really look 3D. Because the center of the daisy, it's not just lots of like circles, and it's not uniform little circles. There is this sort of bumpy texture to it, and all you've got to do is look at the reference and identify the shadows. And I do little circular motions, as you can see, to give that little scribbly effect. But I'm not doing like circles uniformed. I'm doing like little scribbly motions, looped motions, going in circular motions with a pencil. But I'm identifying where the shadows are, and I'm just doing them in that patch. I'm not doing just uniform circles everywhere all the way across the center of the daisy. I'm swapping over to the 2H pencil. I'm working on doing this to the slightly lighter shadows, so the mid-tone values. And I'm doing the same thing. So I've used the 6B to do it with the darker shadows. I'm using the 2H to do it with the mid-tones, and then I'll leave the highlighted areas without any of the charcoal on it. But you can see I'm not going in circular motions. I'm going in circular motions with the pencil, but I'm not just doing like perfect circles. This will help create more of a bumpy texture to it. And that's what you want. You want to give it a bumpy texture. And you won't see all of the individual little circles. A lot of them are overlapping each other. But I found that this technique really does give you that texture and that look that you're going for without taking loads and loads of time, and it does it really nice and effectively. And you can keep building this up and going over the same areas if you need to darken it up, but keep doing these little circular motions and little loops. It's like you're doing little sort of C shapes with your pencil. And as you can see, it's given a very nice bumpy sort of appearance to the center of the daisy. And there's no perfect circles in there at all. I'm going to add some slightly darker ones to add more variation. It's important that you get a variation in for your values and the little sizes of your loops that you're doing. But that's all I want to do for the center of the daisy for now. And I'm going to start to work on the petals. And very similar to the first flower that we drew, I'm going in with the 2H pencil, and I'm starting off by looking at each petal and marking in the darkest areas, which, like before, tends to be where two petals meet. So the petals that are in sort of like the back layers of petals, they're going to have more shadow cast down onto them from the layers of petals in the front. So the front petal that we're doing that's on the left, that's casting a shadow on the petal underneath it. And that's going to be the case. If you've got a petal that's underneath another petal, then it's going to have a shadow cast onto it. I'm also looking for any other little shadows. Looking at the shapes of them, and I'm using a very sharp 2H pencil for this. Whenever I'm working on adding details, I'll make sure my pencil's nice and sharp. I'm going to work on it petal at a time. I'm going to leave the highlighted areas free of any charcoal, just like we did before. I do recommend that you have a go at all 3 of these flowers, because you can really get to grips with the techniques that I'm using, and you'll see that they're very similar techniques. I'm not changing anything. No matter what flower I'm drawing, I'm approaching it in the same way. Just looking at it as a series of shapes and identifying what areas need to be darker and what areas need to be lighter and what sort of textures I need to create. Once again, the shadows of this petal tends to be on the outer edge of the petal, and then with these petals of a daisy, you tend to have a shadow in the middle, like this line going up. Tend to be like 2 little shadowed strips with a highlight in the center and then a highlight on either side of those 2 little shadowed lines. And also the lines again are going with the curvature of the petals. Each petal is curving in a different direction, and the little shadow lines need to go parallel with that, so they're going in the same direction as that. This is going to create little ridges in the petals, give it more detail, and also add that shadow between those 2 petals where the shadow is being cast down onto that petal on the left hand side. If you want to add more layers of the charcoal, then you don't need to apply any more pressure. All you need to do is work at it in different directions, because the pencil is gripping onto the paper's gripping onto the pencil. And if you go and shade the pencil in one direction, then it's only going to touch certain parts of that paper. Whereas there's lots of crevices and dips and valleys in the tooth of the paper and in the paper itself. And if you approach it from lots of different angles, then it's going to hit lots of different crevices in the paper. And so the more angles you approach it at with different layers, the darker it's going to get. So I'm working my way around the flower. And it is really important to see how the petals affect each other. To get a nice 3D look, you do need to have the shadows cast down and think about how different elements of the drawing are going to affect each other. And you may have heard me talk before about the fact that I think there's 4 different things that are really important for a realistic drawing. One of them being contrast, very important, getting your shadows dark enough and your highlights bright enough. Also your colour choice, but in this case, because you're working in grayscale, you don't really have to worry about that one. Also detail, so adding enough level of detail in there, getting in the right textures. So adding the right textures as well as having a good contrast is really going to set you up for having a realistic drawing. And the final thing, which is the sort of basis and foundation for a good drawing, is having a good accurate sketch outline, which I've got tutorials on for how you can get an accurate sketch outline, and also I'll provide the sketch outlines so you can use them as well. If you want to focus on, you know, these other things, this contrast and the detail, then you can use my sketch outline. So as you can see, with each petal there tends to be this little shadow in the middle of the petal, and then shadows on either side of the petal, kind of like outlining it. And you can see that even though it looks like the petals are being outlined, it's not a really harsh outline. If something is outlined really harshly, then it's going to start to look too cartoony, and you don't want your petals to have a cartoony look to them. So make sure it still looks soft and it fades out at the sides as well. So I'm going to continue this process, continue studying your reference image and identifying where the shadows are in each petal. They're mainly either edge and in the middle. Don't add any charcoal to the brightest areas, and because we're working on a daisy which has white petals, they are going to be very highlighted. So I'm just going to carry on working throughout these petals, and then I'll come back to talk you through the next step. Also, if you feel like you need to erase any bits, if you got a bit too much charcoal on them, then I'm using my kneaded eraser to lighten up those areas if I feel like I've applied too much charcoal down. But I don't do that very often at all. To make it easier to judge the values that we need to add to the petals, I'm also going in and adding some value around the outside of the petals. So when I'm working on certain petals, if I feel like I need to get the background done a bit more, then I'll add a bit more shade in there so it's easier to identify and judge what values I need to apply to the petals. Because if it's too light on the background next to it, then I might think that when I'm adding shading to the petals that I'm adding it too dark. But then if you were to get the background in, you'll see that actually it's fine, it's not too dark. Very much like I was talking about with our first study, I spoke about that a bit more. So yeah, like I said, go throughout this and add those petals if you feel like you need to do the background in order to make it easier to judge the values for that petal. Then go in with your 2H and add some shading to the outside of the petals. I'm starting to add some shading to our background daisy as well, and with this you can't really see too much detail in each of the petals, and with the center of the daisy you can't really see the texture of the center of the daisy, but you can see where the shadow changes are. So I'm going in with my 2H pencil and I'm using little circular motions to fill in some shading all of the way across the center of the daisy, but as you can see I'm adding more layers to the bottom of the center where it's a lot darker, and also just underneath the petals on our main daisy there is some shadow just underneath the petals on our main daisy. But as you can see, I'm not getting in any detail, but I am focusing on the value changes. Even with a blurred background, it's important to get in the value changes in order to make sure that even the background has a good contrast to it. And I'm moving back on to working on the petals on the main daisy. You might see that I jump between different areas a bit, and I like to jump around as I spot things that I want to adjust. You can work one area to completion and then move on. I do that as well at certain parts. I'll also probably be adding some shading to our daisies in the background as well. But for now, I'm going to continue to work on the petals on our main daisy, just like we have been doing for all of the other petals. Now I'm starting to add some shading to our daisy in the background, very lightly using the side of our 2H pencil. So the camera just cut out a little bit there, but all I did was very lightly add some shading to that bottom daisy. And when I want to shade in an area very lightly, I like to hold the pencil further to the back and use the side of the pencil. When I'm holding the pencil further to the back, it means that less pressure is being applied to the pencil. Whereas if you hold the pencil right at the front and use the pencil more vertically using the tip of the pencil, then you're more likely to be applying more pressure to it. So if I'm shading in an area, I like to use the pencil a bit further back, hold it further back, and use it more on the side to shade in an area faster. And then when I do details, I like to hold it more towards the front and also use more of the point of the pencil rather than the side. And as you can see with this back daisy, I'm just getting in some shadows on the petals, getting in the little bit of detail that I can see on the reference. Like I did with the other one, I just shaded in that center of the daisy. I didn't add lots of texture to it because you can't really see that, so I'm just focusing on the value changes and not on the detail. Just adding some more shading in between each petal to define them a bit more. And so I've pretty much finished with the shading. We're very close to actually being able to blend all of this out. Just adding some more shading on those back petals. Keep looking around. I keep looking around areas that I've already done to see if I've missed anything or I need to go a bit darker. It's easier once you've got everything in to evaluate and judge whether you need to go darker in any area. But I'm just going to finish off adding all of the detail and shading to the daisies, and then I'll talk you through the next part. Now I'm going to go ahead and add some more shading to these areas in the background that we haven't added any charcoal to yet. So I'm starting off by using our 2H pencil, just very lightly shading it. As you can see, this is what I was talking about. I'm using the pencil on the side of the charcoal tip, and I'm also holding it further towards the back. And I'm approaching it from different angles, as you can see, to actually get more shading and to get it darker, add more layers. And I'm going to repeat this process for all three of those white areas in the background, just to add some value to them. Just looking at the reference and identifying where I need to add the value to. And then just crisscrossing the layers over the top of each other. Just adding multiple layers, especially where it's transitioning from the darkest shadows, you know, that area that's very black, into these more highlighted areas. I want to add some darker layers on the border of those two areas so they transition a little bit smoother. Though you don't need to worry too much because they will blend together nicely when we blend it all out. So I'm just going to finish adding shading to this area. Now I'm going to move on to the center of the daisy again, and I want to add a few more layers before I blend this out. So I'm starting off with my 2H pencil, and I'm just adding some more shading over the whole of the middle of the daisy, just to darken it all up a bit. I was feeling like it was a little bit light, so I'm just going in a few different directions and adding some shading. And now I'm going in with some circular motions just to build up more of those shadows and that texture. Because when we've gone over it with our 2H pencil, it's gonna got rid of a bit of that texture. So I'm just gonna replace it a bit by adding some more layers using those circular motions. You don't have to apply too much pressure. And I'm just going over the same areas that I have before. So I'm just going over those darkest areas with even more layers. So I've already got it all blocked in. I'm just going in and really darkening up bits and adding more texture to it. And you don't need to spend too much longer on this. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill in a bit more detail and add some more layering, and then I will come back to talk you through the next step, which is going to be blending it all out. Also, just before we blend it out, I'm moving on to using the 6B pencil just to add some darker shadows into the center of the daisy, just to add a little bit more contrast. And I'm also looking around the rest of the daisy and the blurred out daisies in the background, and just identifying any areas where I need to add a bit more shadow and darken up the details. Just like we did before in our first flower, I'm just going in and adding this to the darkest areas of that daisy. We won't need to add this to too many areas, just areas that need to be darker and aren't getting dark enough with just a 2H pencil alone. Now I'm going in with my Daler Rowney Filbert brush, and I'm just going in just like we did in the first flower study and just blending all of the background out to start with. I'm adding that excess powder that we get on the brush from blending out the darkest areas onto those lighter areas, and as you can see, it really smooths out everything. It gets rid of that grainy look. We don't see any more of the white grain of the paper showing through. And it just smooths it all out, and that's why you don't have to apply much pressure at all when we're adding the initial layers, because when we blend it out, it just fills in everything and makes it look nice and even and smooth. I'm also blending out those flowers in the background, just focusing on the lightest areas at the moment. And I'm even adding some value to those lighter petals. We can lighten it up after if we need to, if it's too dark. Working on the stem. If you are blending out an area that you know you want to keep quite light and there's too much charcoal powder on your brush, then you can go and dab off and rub off the excess powder from the brush onto a bit of tissue paper. Also, I regularly blow away the charcoal powder so we don't have loads and loads of charcoal powder on the page, because as we blend out, we do create some of that charcoal powder and push some of the charcoal around. Once again, blending out this lighter area. One of the main reasons I don't add any charcoal powder to the lightest areas is because when you actually blend it out, you can add value onto those white areas with the brush. But if I was to go in and add lots of charcoal on it first, then we're going to get that grainy look, because there won't be enough charcoal to actually blend out to get a smooth look, because you want to keep it nice and light, if that makes sense. I'm blending out the center of the daisy as well. As you can see, at the moment I'm mainly focusing on the lighter areas, and I'm just actually stippling that brush. I'm not really swiping it around, I'm just tapping it so we still have a bit of that texture. I'm blending out that back daisy, and so I'm just going to go ahead and blend out all of these areas, being very careful not to smudge it onto the daisy petals. I want to keep them nice and defined. So I'm just going to blend out all of the areas. You can use your fingers as well to blend out the darkest areas so that they don't get too light. Because when you use the brush, it does lighten up those darkest areas a little bit. So if you watched the first part, you'd have seen that with the flower, with the first flower, I did add a second layer of charcoal and actually blend it out with my finger to keep it nice and dark. But with this one, you could just go in and blend all of the darkest areas out straight away with your finger to keep it from lightening up at all. I'm also lightly blending out those daisy petals. I don't want to blend them out too much because I don't want to get too much charcoal powder on them. I'm just softening out those details, shadows I added in the middle of the petals. Just adding a little bit of value to them, because even the lightest areas probably aren't like bright white. They've probably still got a little bit of value added to them. So I do like to dust a little bit of a grey value onto the petals. Just a very light value though. I'm going back over those daisies in the background. I'm smudging out the darkest values into those petals so that it's a softer transition. And now for those darkest areas, like I said, I'm just going in with my finger and blending them out to keep those areas nice and dark so that we're not lightening them up. That's why I didn't blend it out with the brush just yet. I just wanted to go in with these darkest areas and blend it with my fingers. I like the result of doing this a lot better. But I don't recommend using your fingers to blend out lighter areas because you're not going to get really smooth blending. Quite often it's very unpredictable because you can have oils on your fingers, and if you blend out a lighter area and then add more charcoal on top, then you might be able to see smudge marks and grease marks, and it's just not as, it's not going to 100% be nice and smooth. It's harder to control and predict. So just go ahead and blend out all of these darkest areas with your finger. With these small detailed areas around the petals, obviously if you were to use your finger, you would probably smudge it onto the petals, and we don't want to do that because that would make it very hard to erase those areas if we push the charcoal in with our fingers. So I'm going in with a brush and I'm just using that to blend out the charcoal directly around the petals, just so that we don't smudge too much onto the actual petals, and I'll just blow away any of the excess charcoal powder. Now I'm going to start to work on adding another layer of shadow. So I just added a bit more 6B to the bottom of that background daisy so that it just pops a bit more. I just felt like it needed to go a little bit darker. I'm also adding some of the 6B on this top daisy up here, and any areas where you feel like there needs to be a bit more shadow, you can just go in with your 2H or 6B depending on how dark you need to go, and just add a bit more definition. This is the point where you want to focus on getting the shadows all in the right place, because once we've done this, we're going to be focusing on highlights. So make sure you've got all of the areas as dark as they need to be and nice and defined. Just make sure you're happy with it. I continue to blend. I add a bit of the charcoal and then I blend it out to make sure it's looking nice and smooth, especially when I'm working on the background, which is a nice out of focus background. I don't want it to look really defined. I want to separate those petals a bit more, add a bit more shadow, a bit more shade in between them. And I'm adding a bit more shadow on the center of the daisy. Even now you can see that it definitely looks nice and realistic. The main daisy is popping and you can really see the detail and contrast within the flower. All it needs now is just for the highlights to be brought out a little bit and add a little bit more detail definition to it. Make it look nice and crisp. At the moment it's looking a bit fuzzy. So we're just going to be doing like the last sort of steps like we did with our first one, with our first flower. For now I just want to keep blending until I'm happy with the values. Blend out between each of the petals. I don't want any grainy looking areas. I'm adding a light dusting of the charcoal for any areas of the petals that I think need to be darker, or where there's more shadow to the petals, like the back layer of petals where they're slightly darker and have shadows cast on them. So I'm just going to finish off all of the blending and add in some little details with our charcoal pencils, and then I'll come back to talk you through the next step. Now I'm going in with the kneaded eraser and it's time to lift up the highlights. So for the background where it's very blurred out, I'm not going to be using the Tombow Mono eraser because that's very much for like details and getting and defining little crisp areas. But for the background where it's blurry and I want to highlight it, I'm using the kneaded eraser because this is good for getting those softer highlights. So as you can see, I'm focusing on the daisy in the background and I'm starting by focusing on that front petal. And I just lighten up the area, and then because it looks a bit harsh with just the kneaded eraser, I'm going in with a clean part of a tissue, which again is very good for blending over charcoal and softening things out. And then I just soften out that area that we erased so that it's very nice and smooth. And then I just repeat the process, going in with the kneaded eraser on the next petal. Just lightening up any areas that I need to. And again, if it looks too harsh, you can go in with your tissue to blend it out, to soften it up. Use a clean part of the tissue so that you're not actually adding any more charcoal to the paper. This is really good for getting little detailed highlights as well, because you can mold and knead the eraser into the shape that you need it to be. I'm also using the tissue. The tissue is good at also very slightly highlighting areas. So if you go in with a clean bit of tissue over a dark area, then it will lift up some of that charcoal and give it a lighter, more highlighted look to it. So now I'm working on the second daisy, pulling up the highlights. Because these petals are very long and thin, I'm moulding it into very much a flat edge so I can easily work on that petal, mould it into the shape of the petal. And I'm adding a little bit of detail to the centre of the daisy, but not too much. Mainly focusing on getting those highlights on each petal. And it's not like I know off the top of my head where the highlights should go. I'm just studying the reference, identifying the lightest areas in each section and just replicating that using my kneaded eraser. It's important not to imagine where the highlights will go. It's important to study the reference and go off that. I'm also going to use that kneaded eraser to lighten up areas of the petals on our main daisy, because a lot of them have got a bit too much charcoal on, especially on the left hand side. There's a bit too much charcoal on them, so I will want to pull up some highlights. And these petals are very much smooth. There's not as much detail on these petals as with the first flower. So we can just swipe and lift off the charcoal very easily using the kneaded eraser. We don't have to add lots of details with the erasers. For the edges of the petals, where I want to create a nice crisp edge, because some of the charcoal's gone over onto the petals, I'm using the Tombow Mono eraser. If your eraser is dirty, then I do recommend going in with an X-Acto knife and just using this to cut off the tip of the eraser so that it's nice and clean. Because as you go and work on it for a while, if you've been using the eraser for a few minutes on a few petals, it will start to build up charcoal on it and it might not work as effectively. The harder you apply pressure to the eraser, the more it's going to erase and lift off that charcoal. So if you need a really bright highlight, then apply a bit more pressure like I'm doing now to really lift up that charcoal. And don't worry if you highlight an area too much, because you can always go over the top and add more charcoal using the brushes or the charcoal pencils themselves. But in order to make the flower in the front look in focus and look more in focus than the ones in the back and the background, you do need to have a very crisp edge to the petals and the flower. So I'm just going to continue what I've been doing with these petals and just continue all of the way around the flower. Just using this exact same technique. Now that I'm happy with the highlights in those petals, like I did before, you might want to just go in with your charcoal pencils and going in with my 6H and just define areas a bit more, make sure they're nice and clean and chiseled. The edges are nice and clean. And just if any areas need to be a bit darker, just go in, apply a bit more pressure and get them as dark as they need to be so that it really pops. The contrast is the difference between the darkest values and the lightest values. So if you really want the petals to pop and they've got quite a light value to them, then to make them pop you need to have really dark values next to them to contrast against that. And as you can see, just adding those few details will make it pop a lot more. Just adding a few little shadows in between the petals as well. And the next thing that I'm going to do is work on the center of the daisy and just go in with our Tombow Mono eraser and just start to add the highlights to the daisy in the center. I want to give it that textured look, so I'm going in little circular motions. And I'm not doing this everywhere, I'm just picking out certain areas where it's more highlighted within the center. And as you can see, I'm just dabbing on the eraser, going in light circular motions to lift up and create more highlights. And you want to do very similar motions to what you did when you actually used the charcoal pencils. Just very scribbly sort of patterns. I'm not applying much pressure to the eraser at all because I just want to slightly lift up the charcoal just to create that variation in the values, but it's not like the highlights are really, really bright. And this just gives it even more of an accurate texture. But again, if you find that you're lifting and highlighting the areas a bit too much, then we can go in with our charcoal pencils and just add a bit more shadow. You can also use your kneaded eraser. You can mold it into a tiny little point and use that to highlight slightly larger areas. Now I'm just adding a few more shadows in between these highlights, and I'm going to be switching between my charcoal pencils and my eraser until I'm happy with the finished result on the center of the flower. I'm also going to be just blending a bit more of that powder over the middle section there. And you can keep tweaking it and adjusting it. You might have thought it was fine a few minutes ago, and it was fine. I just wanted to adjust it a little bit more, but just keep working it until you're happy with your center of the daisy. I also just want to add a little bit of highlight to the center of the stem as well. So I want to create a bit more of a three-dimensional look to the stem. At the moment it's very flat looking, there isn't much highlight in there. So I'm just going in with our Tombow Mono Eraser and very lightly shading this on to create a little bit of highlight in the center of that stem. And this already makes it look a lot more realistic. But because it was a bit too sort of light, I just went over and blended over it with a brush. And I'm just going to go and clean up the edges of that stem using our 6B pencil. Because using the brush did lighten up the background a little bit. So I just want to replenish that shadow by going in with some of the 6B pencil. And also the charcoal block. Just blending it out with my finger so that it doesn't lighten up too much. And adding the charcoal block again to the left hand side of the stem. Every time I'm using the charcoal block, I'm blending it out with my finger because I want it to stay nice and dark. Once again, I'm blending out these lighter areas with the tissue just to lighten it up a bit. Make it pop a bit more. And because I want it to be a bit lighter, I'm going in with my kneaded eraser. And I really just want to go in and brighten that up. I will be using a tissue to soften up those edges. Otherwise, as you could see, it was looking a bit harsh on the edges where we use that kneaded eraser. So anyway guys, I'm just going to finish off by adding a few more details with the charcoal pencil, like I did with the last flower, just adding any more details and shadows where I need to, mainly outlining the edges of the actual petals just to make sure they stand out as much as they can. But that is pretty much it for this tutorial. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the final one where we'll be working on the tulip. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye everybody.